In today's lecture, we're going to be looking at a lot of the conglomerations of the things that we've talked about, how they've actually impacted the policy of the criminal justice system and other interrelated systems. So the authors in the Politics of Injustice text identify six sort of noteworthy get tough policies that have really had a major impact on the way the system looks today. And the way that they look at these policies is based on the significance for criminal punishment and justice expansion, so the criminal justice system impact, and also the impacts they will have on the individuals, impacts on civil liberties, impacts on people's ability to participate in democracy. The six policies that we're going to talk about are drug policing, punitive sentencing models, the revival of the death penalty, retreat from juvenile justice, hardened prisons, and community surveillance. And we've talked recently about the prison system, a little bit further back about the death penalty. And we've talked throughout the whole semester about punitive sentencing models, war on drugs. We talked specifically about juvenile justice as well. And we've seen what that system looks like in practice in the Vice video, where we followed individuals that were being punished by the system, and also individuals that were being cared for by the juvenile justice system. So drug policing, again, we talked about a lot of these things throughout the course of the semester, where the whole role of the police has been fighting the war on drugs and how problematic that can be. When people think about a police officer, oftentimes they don't think about a neighborhood officer walking a beat. They think about an officer in military tactical gear executing a raid. One of the big problems that we've had and sort of incentivizing this is civil asset forfeiture. Unless you link a video about that this week for you all to watch. And what that sort of looks like. Basically, starting in the early 1970s, the police were allowed to keep the things that they seized. So if they seized money, that money would go into discretionary funds to be spent on police activities. If they seized property, they could sell the property. If it's legal property, they don't sell the drugs. They're not supposed to sell the drugs. But things like houses, cars, oftentimes DEA agents will use the cars that they seize, like on other operations. If they have a nice Porsche, a Ferrari, a McLaren, something like that, they'll use it in undercover operations. But even with the money that they've seized, we're still spending a lot. Spending a lot of monetary resources, and also in terms of hours in the day that police officers can operate. We're using a lot of that time to address the war on drugs. So this chart looks at thousands of adults arrested for drug violations, and you see a very extreme increase during the late 1970s into the 80s, and even going up further into the 90s and the early 2000s. And keep in mind that the period before this time, before 1975, is really when these drug laws were created. So to see an increase, coming after the hippie movement of the 60s shows, again, how much they were really ramping this up. They were already arresting at a higher rate than was probably necessary in 1975, and were at 4 times that just 25 years later. And as we saw in the lecture about drugs, 4 out of every 5 arrests are for possession. They're not for sale or distribution or anything that really has association with the violent aspects of the drug trade. They're for people having what amounts to either just a unprocessed plant, or a plant, or even some of the more dangerous chemicals, methamphetamines, illegitimate prescription pills. It's not something that needs to be addressed from a criminal justice standpoint. These are public health issues. Addiction is something you can't punish away. again, as we talked about with prisons, and some of the things that have highlighted how dangerous prisons are, how prolific drugs are inside of there. It doesn't make any sense. We're not addressing the issue of addiction at all. And during this time period, we see actually a reduction in drug use. So drug usage is going down. Again, from the peak in the 1970s, again, there was a lot more association with drugs in popular culture in the mid to late 1960s into the 1970s. And I would argue today it's just been replaced by alcohol references. It's very common for songs to be about drinking, partying in clubs, and even on the radio, they freely talk about alcohol-related activities, but they blur out things like talking about smoking marijuana or taking harder drugs. There are some songs, if you hear them on the radio now, where they're taking out 2 or 3 whole lines, and it almost sounds like an instrumental song for a second, because they have to stop the whole line when someone's talking about rolling a blunt or smoking a blunt in a car. There are a couple of Nelly songs that have gotten censored pretty heavily because we've, as a I say we, but the people that make decisions about what goes over public airways, radio and television, have sought to remove a lot of the overt references to drugs, especially again, if you just listen to some of the popular songs during the late 1960s versus what's played today, it's a lot more heavily censored in terms of what is said. And I've even had occasions where I've heard a song on the radio, I like it, and then I go listen to the uncensored version, and they're talking about completely different things. There's a Post Malone song where on the radio he's talking about alcohol-related behaviors, and then in the explicit version he's talking about explicit sex acts. So they're substituting a reference to a sexual behavior with a alcohol-related behavior. Again, as we've talked about before, a lot of these drug policing happens in particular areas, typically in poor areas of urban environments where we see a higher percentage of non-white community members. And we've seen a concentration of those community members in those poorer census tracts over the last 40 years. It was happening before we started the war on drugs, and that's really just kicked it into a lot of gear. Some of the reasons why this happens is drugs are sold in these areas in open air markets, very brazen selling, as opposed to what happens in the suburbs or in the nicer parts of the city where people have houses that the drug dealers can come in. They can meet in secluded areas that don't receive a lot of police attention because they're not seen as high crime areas. Also, the people that live in this area are politically powerless. Some of them systematically are disenfranchised from voting because they've been convicted of felonies. Others are just not aware of how important the process is in making your voice heard. The people in those areas aren't the ones that win city council races. They don't represent us in our state legislature or in the national legislature because they can't afford to run a campaign. So again, it's a very cyclical process. Also, those neighborhoods have people that fit the media image of a drug dealer, of a bad person, of a dangerous person. And we saw that specifically with the darkening of the mugshot of O.J. Simpson, and it was very telling about what types of offenders news media look to put on television. We've also seen the increase in the punitive sentencing models. Again, we talked a lot about that throughout the course of the semester. Main ones are mandatory minimums, 3 strikes laws, things that take power away from judges, that even potentially, once the charges are in place, reduce a potentially even a prosecutor's ability to affect the outcome of a trial process. Um, Again, these things were created without a lot of forethought, without a lot of consideration for how they would impact society long term. They were catchy, and people sort of jumped onto the bandwagon. Again, mandatory minimums, 3 strikes, also truth in sentencing laws, where you have to do a particular amount of the time that you're assigned. Usually that's 80%. We have some of those in Georgia, depending on what crime you're actually convicted for. Mandatory minimums, again, we've talked about this throughout the course of the semester. It was really problematic with drug cases at the federal level. So this has actually been changed, this discrepancy here. The amount of powder cocaine has been reduced to 50 grams. So instead of having 500 grams, they recently changed this during President Obama's term, because that was one of the biggest issues. Was you had to have half a kilogram of powder cocaine or 5 grams of crack cocaine to have the same sentence. And honestly, if you have 5 grams of powder cocaine and 5 grams of crack cocaine, there's less actual cocaine in the crack because of the way that it's created, mixed with baking soda, it's stabilized to be smokable. But as you see, there's vast disparities in the amount of drugs that you have to have the same sentence. So 100 grams of heroin, now 50 grams of powder cocaine, 5 grams of crack cocaine, 50 grams of PCP, 50 grams of amphetamines, 1 gram of LSD, and then basically a truckload, 100 kilograms of marijuana. And this was in place before a lot of the states were legalizing marijuana, both recreationally and medically. But again, it just shows, and honestly, marijuana is still a Schedule I drug in the DEA scheduling. So the 3 that are on this list, the 4 really with heroin, they're all Schedule I. You have to have 100 kilograms of marijuana, 1 gram of LSD, 50 grams of PCP, or 100 grams of heroin for all of the same schedule of drug, the same, what the Drug Enforcement Agency classifies as the same sort of danger level of drug. It's all over the place. So when you have these mandatory minimums, it does, again, reduce a lot of the power of the judges. In some cases where the prosecutor is deciding what they want to charge someone with, that can really affect the whole outcome and what they can plea down to, what they decide to eventually charge someone with, has a lot of power, and there's not anyone to oversee that power. A prosecutor, a district attorney, is oftentimes basically the highest law enforcement official in that area. So in Fulton County, for instance, there's no one to tell the district attorney what to do. If he does something that's blatantly illegal, he could be censored by the Georgia Bar Association, potentially even the governor's office or law enforcement. But as long as he's legally operating within the confines of what he can do, not necessarily should do, there's no check on that power. And we've seen that there's been a push during the 80s and the 90s to throw the book basically at drug offenders. Drug offenders in prisons rose 1,000% during the last 2 decades of the 20th century. Most of those going in have been convicted of a drug offense in the past. And we've seen, again, a large increase in the number of people coming in. And the only type of crime that's been going up during this period has been drug offenses. We see a disproportional impact with mandatory minimums on minority community members. Um, when we look at arrests for powder cocaine versus crack cocaine, African Americans account for 90% of crack arrests, but only 30% of powder cocaine arrests. And again, these drugs are used by race. All drugs are used by all races with relatively even rates. There's not really any sort of white drug or black drug or Latino drug. People just use drugs because they create an effect on the person. We've also seen school zones having increased effect on areas where people can't commute to school. So if you're in an urban environment, these, again, high, non-white, low socioeconomic census tracts, the people are walking to schools. So they're living in the areas around schools, which means that increased punishments for crimes committed in areas around schools disproportionately affect those individuals. While we've seen an increase across the board in terms of incarceration during the 1980s and the 1990s, it was more felt more raised at a higher rate in some of these non-white communities. And we see a 700% increase in black incarceration during this time compared to only a 300% increase for whites. In 1997, over half of state inmates were black, again making up less than 20% of the population, but making up over half of the inmates in state institutions. We've also seen the three strikes laws, again, where it doesn't matter what the third strike is. The idea is to try to prevent people from having these careers in crime, but really it just caused a lot of overpopulation in the prison system, the people that you can't let out. It sounds good in the immediate, but when you're actually looking at someone, committing a third strike in their 20s, they're going to be in prison for 50 or 60 years. If they get life without parole, that's very expensive. There are other things that could be done, and we'll talk about some of those things to try to address the behavior instead of just committing to paying $40,000 to $60,000 a year to keep someone incarcerated because they've committed 3 felonies. Again, so having that third offense be petty can be very problematic. Again, getting a life sentence for stealing. There was a case where a guy's third strike was stealing a golf club. It was a $500 golf club. Depending on what state you're in, the value of the club might be different. If you steal it from a place that has it on sale and it only has a monetary value of $250, that might not be a felony charge. But because you stole it a day after the sale ended, you're getting a felony and you're going to going to prison for the rest of your life. There's so much nuance that happens in these cases that it doesn't make sense to write law as an absolute. We see the same thing in the truth in sentencing legislation, where you're preventing people from being released early, sort of capping how much good time they can receive. And again, it's something that sounds good when you're talking about people going into prison, but when you're having to maintain the person in there for 50 years or for 60 years or 40 years, even 10 years, keeping someone in prison for 10 years costs about $500,000, right? And that's not even taking into consideration the potential contribution that person might be making to the tax base. So say that person's even got a shitty job and they're making $25,000 a year, they're paying, probably $2,000 or $3,000 in taxes. So you're taking this money that you're spending on them by putting them in prison, and you're taking them away from the potential tax base. It's typically people receive less money in welfare benefits, SNAP, food stamps, whatever you would call it. They receive less benefits than it costs to keep someone incarcerated. So it makes sense, financial sense, to pay someone to not be in prison. And with drugs, it's like you could pay someone $20,000 a year to sit on someone's couch and take heroin, which is in no way anything that I'm suggesting happen. Just from a pure financial thought experiment, it's cheaper to pay someone to live in squalor and take drugs than it is to keep them incarcerated. And neither of those things is going to really address the core root of addiction. We've also seen increases in the death penalty system. And again, I don't want my opinion on the matter to unduly influence anyone. I don't think you should let anyone's opinion on anything have you should stay open-minded and stay critical of any topic. I think that the death penalty system right now is broken. I think that it should be fixed to be implemented more, not to be implemented less. That's my own opinion. But I think the system that we have in place now is racially biased. It's inefficient, ineffective. It's too costly, and it's implemented too selectively. Because of that, it's very expensive to execute someone in this country, often costing millions of dollars. But again, you're weighing that against how much it costs to keep someone incarcerated for the entirety of their life. You know, if someone commits murder in their 20s, again, 50 to 60 years incarceration, you're looking at between, low side $2 million, on the high side $4 million just to keep them incarcerated. So it's something that we if we want to have the death penalty in this country, the system is going to need a lot of changes. One of the issues with this is the exonerations that have taken place, and again, that's, I think, a failing of the system, that these cases aren't reviewed, or they're reviewed too frequently by the people that have already reviewed the cases. It's common in criminal cases for appeals to be heard at the lower level, to be heard by the trial judge. The trial judge has already seen the case. You need to have fresh eyes on some of these cases to look at some of the things, to go over the evidence, to look for potential inconsistencies or biases that are taking place. But the issue of exonerations is a big problem and a big concern with the system, and one of the reasons why I said it needs to have a serious overhaul if we're going to keep that in place. I'm not necessarily opposed to removing it. I just want whatever system we have to be as fair as it can be, and as evenly used as it possibly can be. Because again, that's not what's happening. Most of the inmates executed have been black. Again, over half. Also, almost 4 out of 5, almost 80% of inmates were executed for killing a white person. So there's a clear difference in the punishments that are being handed out. And again, that's another one of the major issues with the system, is that we're punishing similar actions differently based on the circumstances. My opinion is, if you intentionally kill someone, then that should be the death penalty. It's not a popular opinion, but I think it is a fairer one. But again, like I said, I'm not opposed to even the removal of the death penalty, as long as whatever we are doing in a fair manner. And again, as we saw on the slides about the death penalty, 98% of lead prosecutors in the death penalty cases are white. We've also seen, and you hear about this a lot, retreat from juvenile justice, trying to bring these cases into the adult court and the adult system. It's tough because sometimes young people do very serious things that have very lasting outcomes on the victims, on the co-victims of homicides. But when we make changes to the system that are going to impact thousands of people in the future, we should do so with as level a head as possible. Take some time and figure out, what do we really want to see the system do, instead of just making cuts when there should be, again, consideration for what's the outcome going to be going forward. Recently in Atlanta, a juvenile offender, during the course of a robbery, murdered an individual. It was a black teenager murdering a white adult coming out of a wedding at an affluent area of the city. And the juvenile had been released previously on a pretrial diversion program from offending. There were a lot of calls then to basically scrap the entire juvenile justice program in Georgia, and that's an incorrect thinking. It's not going to have any effect on bringing back the person. You could make the argument that you're trying to stop things from happening in the future, but a system, removing the juvenile justice system, is going to have more harm than good. You're going to create more hardened criminals by processing juvenile offenders as adults than you are going to be preventing them from committing acts if they're shown leniency by the system. The point of the juvenile justice system is to fix the problem, to address it, not to indoctrinate young offenders into the criminal justice system and the meat grinder that it is. We've also seen a lot of increase in prison construction, although most prison systems are stretched to the limit. There's not enough funding now to build many new facilities or even to appropriately staff the ones that they have. There were instances in Colorado and Oregon during the late 1990s and early 2000s where they built prisons. By the time they were finished building them or nearly finished building them, they didn't have the money to staff them. So they just sat empty. Some of them were used for filming locations and things like that, but they basically ran out of money and they just couldn't do anything with them. There are a lot of increases in the supermax facilities, even maximum security facilities, creating more. You have to keep individuals that you want to put in those facilities in a lot of times isolation. But a lot of those people are the ones that should be there. Violent offenders are the ones that should be in prison. Putting people in prison, especially the supermaxes or even maximum security, for engaging in drug activities is disingenuous. The reason that the drug networks are so consistent and so lucrative is because that's where the money is. And the money's there because they're illegal. So we're creating a system where we're really creating this economy for drugs, and then punishing people for following American capitalistic roots. That by any means necessary, it doesn't matter how you get there as long as you get there mentality that we've seen in sort of the American dream system that the authors Mesner and Rosenfeld have talked about. And you see 1,000 new prisons built in the 1990s. Many states, over half the states, are over capacity at this point, having to do things like putting double the people in a cell, creating a dormitory format, out-of-state contracts, which is really problematic. One of the things that keeps people grounded when they're in a incarcerated situation is being able to visit with family. If you get arrested for a drug felony in Los Angeles and you get warehoused to Idaho, your family's not going to be able to visit you very often. We've also seen a massive increase in the violence in prisons, and the stigma associated with being an ex-con and trying to get a job has been more and more of an issue as we place more and more restrictions on hiring processes. We've also seen increases in surveillance that takes place. Part of that is due to a liable issue. You know, they put more cameras in urban environments. Atlanta has a lot of cameras, sort of modeling them after London, because they want to be able to know what happened when something does happen. But we've also seen increases in things like Ring doorbells, people putting cameras inside their houses, increases in technology like license plate readers. You know, it used to be the police would sometimes drive around and randomly type in license plates to see if the car was registered properly. Now they have technology that every license plate in front of them is automatically read. And it kind of goes alongside with safety. People want to feel safe, so they give up some of their liberties. And then we don't really know when we've gone too far in this process. So it's something that is sort of needing to be considered, and you know how much is too much. We've also seen an increase in the monitoring of people that commit offenses, and sort of in basically probation, the system monitoring them. We've seen a lot of probation and parole violation upticks. They result in those violations result in 40% of new admissions to prisons, which is over doubled since 1980. Increased electronic monitoring, conditional releases to halfway houses or day reporting centers, which are oftentimes privatized. So they're making money off of these things. So we see issues of racial profiling, privacy issues, a lot of sort of, I don't want to say unintended consequences, because it's the point of surveilling to see what's happening. But now that we see it, you know, if you drug test every probationer, then you're going to find a bunch of positive tests. And that's not to say that we shouldn't drug test probationers, but we need to see what we're really achieving by doing what we're doing. Okay, so again, just some of the issues we're talking about here, some of the crime control flaws with what's happening now. You're keeping people incarcerated much longer than is needed in terms of aging out of crime. Also, when you pull a drug dealer off the street, you're not removing drugs from that neighborhood, you're creating a job opportunity. Also, the idea that these people that are engaging in criminal behavior and drug-related behavior are doing so from the same rationale as the people that are making the policies is not appropriate. They're not. People don't have the same access to opportunities in these high-crime, low-income census tracts. To them, drug sales might be a rational decision. Rationality is very subjective. We've also seen a lot of prison socialization. Again, people learning new crimes, learning other ways to commit offenses. We've also seen increased concentration and disadvantage in these areas, especially in urban markets. Black market boom. It's not just the drugs selling other uh, counterfeit materials. It sort of snowballs. Instead of being able to tax these substances and potentially put a lot of that money into drug treatment, drug prevention programs, the money is going to drug cartels. It's going to other criminal organizations. If we just try to use interdiction, punish our way out of this, it creates higher prices for the drugs. Drugs have actually gone down a lot in price. When you look at cocaine, for instance, cocaine and heroin are the two clearest examples. The purity over the last 40 years has gone up from 10 to 15%, to now street level drugs can be 60 to 80% pure. So we're talking about a 4 times increase in the potency, and the price has actually gone down. It's gone down even with inflation. So a gram of cocaine that might have cost $100 in 1980 sells for $60 or $70 now, and it's 4 times as pure. So the economics of this are all just out of whack. And where the money goes is, again, part of the issue. We've seen cuts in social welfare programs, education programs to fund the continued war on drugs. Joblessness, family disruption. We're taking 2 generations of viable males and females as well that have been involved in these drug organizations out of these neighborhoods. And we're basically, because the police don't have the ability to monitor a neighborhood 24 hours a day, the people that live in these high crime areas are basically left to fend for themselves. We also see an increase in the prison industrial complex, that there is a vested interest in expanding the system, keeping the system where it is. There's a lot of people employed by by the correctional system. Prison sites become political because the inmates count for residents in terms of tax proportions that are divvied out by the state and the federal government, but the individuals there can't vote because of felony disenfranchisement. So it's a very corrupt process in terms of where the money is flowing around these areas, and prison is a very expensive market every year. New devices, new facilities. It's not. It's just like any other. It's become just like any other industry, and it's not supposed to be that. It's not supposed to be run for profit. It's supposed to be there to address people's behaviors and rehabilitate them, instead of just dehumanizing them, exposing them to violence, and then releasing them after they've been completely stripped of their humanity. So again, those are the major issues with the system that we have in place now. And in the next lecture, we're going to look at some ways that we're hopefully going to be able to address some of these problems going forward.